On February 7, 2026, the Canadian government executed the largest asset seizure in North American history. Without warning, without negotiation, without the diplomatic choreography that usually precedes actions of this magnitude, Prime Minister Mark Carney invoked emergency economic powers to freeze and transfer control of $180 billion in American corporate holdings across Canadian territory. Bank accounts locked, property titles transferred, supply chains severed. The largest peaceful expropriation of foreign assets since the 1970s, carried out in under 72 hours. And the justification came down to two words: proportional response. For weeks, the rhetoric had been escalating. Trump threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods. He demanded territorial concessions. He floated the idea of economic annexation disguised as integration. The Canadian government issued warnings. They called for dialogue. They appealed to decades of partnership. But Washington kept pushing. The assumption, apparently, was that Canada would absorb the pressure, negotiate from weakness, and ultimately bend. That assumption just shattered. What Carney did was not an emotional reaction. It was a calculated demonstration that middle powers, when pushed beyond tolerance, possess leverage that superpowers too often forget exists. And that leverage, once deployed, changes everything. The mechanics of what just happened are straightforward, but the implications are not. Under the Special Economic Measures Act, expanded and amended in emergency parliamentary sessions over the past 2 weeks, the Canadian government identified and froze American corporate assets across 3 primary categories: energy infrastructure, financial holdings, and real estate. The energy sector bore the largest impact. American companies hold significant stakes in Canadian oil sands operations, natural gas extraction facilities, and pipeline networks. Collectively, these holdings are valued at approximately $87 billion. Overnight, operational control transferred to a newly established Crown Corporation tasked with managing seized assets during what the government is calling a period of economic defense. The financial sector was next. American banks, investment firms, and insurance companies operate extensively across Canada. Their combined assets under management, their real estate portfolios, their loan books, all of it now sits under Canadian government supervision. The valuation here is harder to pin down precisely, but government filings place it near $62 billion. Then there is real estate. American individuals, corporations, and investment funds own substantial property across Canadian cities. Commercial towers in Toronto and Vancouver, industrial parks in Alberta, residential developments in Montreal. The seizure extends to all of it. Estimates place this category at $31 billion, though the true figure may be higher depending on how mineral rights and land leases are ultimately calculated. The legal framework Carney is using is not unprecedented, but its scale is. Canada has used economic sanctions and asset freezes before, primarily against foreign governments accused of human rights violations or threats to international peace. Russia after the Ukraine invasion, Iran under nuclear sanctions, Venezuela during political crises. But this is the first time the mechanism has been deployed against the United States. The government's legal justification rests on a principle embedded in international trade law. When one nation imposes punitive economic measures that threaten the sovereignty and economic stability of another, the affected nation has the right to respond proportionally to defend its national interests. Carney's government argues that Trump's threatened tariffs constitute an existential economic threat. Canada sends 75% of its exports to the United States. The American market represents roughly $450 billion in annual trade. A 100% tariff would effectively cut that trade in half or worse, triggering immediate recession, mass unemployment, and fiscal collapse. According to Canadian economic modeling, such tariffs would cost the country $120 billion in lost GDP within the first year. 2 million jobs would be at risk. Government revenues would crater. The social safety net would buckle. In this framing, seizing $180 billion in American assets is not aggression. It is defensive economic warfare designed to create leverage and impose costs that force reconsideration. The immediate reaction from Washington has been predictable, but also revealing. Trump called it theft and promised devastating consequences. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described it as the largest unlawful expropriation in modern history and vowed that Canada would face total economic isolation. Senator Marco Rubio demanded immediate sanctions and called for NATO to expel Canada if the assets are not returned within 48 hours. But underneath the outrage, there is something else: uncertainty. Because the United States now faces a problem it has not had to solve in generations. How do you retaliate against a country that is simultaneously your largest trading partner, your closest military ally, and the nation that controls critical supply chains feeding American industry? The energy sector exposure is the most immediate pressure point. Canada supplies roughly 60% of American crude oil imports. That is 4.3 million barrels per day flowing south across the border. If Canada disrupts that supply, even partially, American refineries face shortages within weeks. Gasoline prices would spike. Diesel costs would surge. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, already depleted after years of politically motivated releases, cannot compensate for a sustained disruption. And here is the critical detail that most coverage is missing. The infrastructure that moves that oil, the pipelines, the rail networks, the border terminals, much of it is now under Canadian government control following the asset seizures. Carney has not threatened to shut off the oil. Not yet. But the implication is clear. Canada now holds a kill switch on a significant portion of American energy supply. And if Washington escalates, if Trump moves forward with tariffs or imposes counter-sanctions, that switch could be flipped. The economic consequences would be immediate and severe, not just for the United States, but for North America as a whole. Supply chains do not respect borders. Refineries in Texas process Canadian crude. Factories in Ontario assemble components made in Michigan. The integration runs so deep that inflicting pain on one side guarantees pain on the other. But Canada's calculation appears to be that they can endure that pain longer and more cohesively than a politically fractured United States heading into a contentious election year. The financial sector implications are almost as severe. American banks operate in Canada not as a courtesy, but because Canadian markets are profitable and strategically important. J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citigroup, all of them have significant Canadian operations. Those operations are now frozen. Canadian clients cannot access accounts. Transactions are halted. Credit lines are suspended. For individual Canadians, this is disruptive. For corporations operating across the border, it is catastrophic. But the pain runs both ways. American banks are now cut off from billions in assets they cannot liquidate, cannot transfer, and cannot use to meet regulatory capital requirements. If this freeze extends beyond a few weeks, it triggers cascading financial stress that regulators on both sides will struggle to contain. Then there is the real estate dimension, which might seem secondary but carries long-term strategic weight. American ownership of Canadian real estate has been a contentious political issue for years. Rising property prices in Vancouver and Toronto have been blamed partly on foreign investment, including American buyers. Seizing these assets allows Carney to address a domestic political pressure point while simultaneously hitting American wealth. The message to Canadian voters is clear. We are taking back control of our own territory. The message to Washington is equally clear. Your citizens' wealth is not safe if you threaten ours. What makes this situation so volatile is that neither side has an easy off-ramp. Trump cannot simply back down. His entire political brand is built on never showing weakness, on winning every confrontation, on forcing other nations to submit. If he retreats now, if he lifts the tariff threats without securing the return of seized assets, it will be framed as a humiliating defeat. But if he escalates, if he imposes the tariffs or goes further with sanctions, he triggers the exact supply chain disruptions and economic pain that could cost him the 2026 midterms and damage his 2028 re-election prospects. He is trapped between his rhetoric and reality. Carney, on the other hand, has staked his entire prime ministership on this gamble. If the asset seizure forces Washington to negotiate and ultimately de-escalate, he becomes the leader who stood up to American bullying and won. He cements Canada's reputation as a sovereign power capable of defending its interests. But if this spirals into a full economic war, if supply chains collapse and recession hits, he will be blamed for the devastation. His political survival depends on convincing Canadians that the short-term pain is worth the long-term preservation of sovereignty. And right now, polling suggests Canadians are with him. Approval ratings have surged. Even opposition parties are rallying behind the government. National unity in the face of external threat is a powerful force. The international reaction has been cautious, but telling. The European Union issued a statement calling for restraint and dialogue, but notably did not condemn Canada's action. Germany's chancellor described it as a regrettable but understandable response to disproportionate American threats. France went further, with President Macron stating that Canada had every right to defend its economic sovereignty using all available tools. The United Kingdom, caught between its historical Commonwealth ties and its post-Brexit dependence on American trade, offered only vague calls for diplomatic resolution. But the silence from other nations speaks louder than any statement. No one is rushing to America's defense. No one is threatening Canada with consequences. In Beijing, there is undoubtedly quiet satisfaction. China has spent years arguing that American economic power is wielded as a weapon, that the dollar-dominated system is fundamentally coercive, and that nations need alternatives. Canada just provided the most dramatic validation of that argument imaginable. If even America's closest ally can be pushed to the point of seizing American assets, what does that say about the stability of the international economic order? Chinese state media has been running non-stop coverage, framing the crisis as proof that American hegemony is collapsing and that multipolarity is inevitable. Russia, similarly, sees an opportunity. Moscow has spent years under Western sanctions and asset freezes. Now, a Western nation is using the same tools against the United States. The propaganda value is enormous. Russian officials have issued statements expressing solidarity with Canada's right to defend itself economically. It is cynical and opportunistic, but it is also effective messaging to the global South, where resentment of American economic dominance runs deep. What happens next depends on decisions being made in real time. There are essentially three paths forward, and none of them are clean. The first path is negotiated de-escalation. Trump and Carney find a face-saving compromise. The tariffs are quietly shelved. The asset seizures are gradually unwound. Both sides declare victory and move on. This is the best-case scenario, but it requires both leaders to prioritize stability over ego. Based on their public statements and political incentives, that seems unlikely in the immediate term. The second path is managed escalation. Trump imposes some version of the tariffs, but at a lower level than threatened. Canada retains control of some seized assets, but releases others. Both sides inflict pain, both sides absorb pain, and eventually the economic consequences force them back to the table. This is the most probable outcome, but it is also the most dangerous. Managed escalation has a tendency to become unmanaged. Once supply chains break, once financial systems freeze, once workers lose jobs and companies go bankrupt, the political pressure to keep fighting intensifies rather than diminishes. The third path is full rupture. Trump goes ahead with 100% tariffs. Canada shuts down energy exports. Financial systems decouple. The longest undefended border in the world becomes a hardened economic frontier. This would be catastrophic for both nations, but it would also represent a complete breakdown of the post-World War II North American order. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have spent 80 years building integrated economies and supply chains. Tearing that apart would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. And here is the deeper question that this crisis forces into the open. What does American power actually mean in 2026? For decades, the assumption has been that economic integration made conflict between the United States and its allies impossible, that shared prosperity created unbreakable bonds, that the benefits of cooperation so vastly outweighed the costs of confrontation that no rational actor would choose rupture. But that assumption rested on a foundation of mutual respect and restraint. It assumed that the United States would not weaponize its economic power against its closest partners. It assumed that threats would remain rhetorical rather than actionable. Trump has shattered that assumption. By threatening Canada with economic annihilation, he has forced Ottawa to treat Washington as an adversary rather than an ally. And once that psychological shift occurs, once the relationship is redefined as adversarial, all the old rules stop applying. Canada is not seeking confrontation, but they are no longer assuming that cooperation will be rewarded or that restraint will be reciprocated. They are acting as a sovereign power defending vital interests against a larger, more powerful neighbor who has demonstrated hostility. And in that framing, Seizing $180 billion in assets is not extreme. It is rational. The broader lesson extends far beyond North America. Every ally of the United States is watching this unfold and recalculating their assumptions about what American partnership actually means. If Canada can be threatened this way, anyone can. If the largest trading relationship in the world can be destabilized over political grievances, no relationship is safe. The message being received in capitals from Seoul to Berlin to Canberra is clear. Dependence on the United States is a vulnerability, not a strength. Diversification is not just economically prudent, it is existentially necessary. The asset seizure Canada just executed will be studied for decades, not because of its immediate economic impact, though that is significant, but because of what it represents. A middle power pushed to the edge, discovering that it has more leverage than it realized. An ally betrayed by threats, choosing sovereignty over submission. And a superpower, accustomed to dominance, learning that the world it built is more fragile than it understood. The next 72 hours will determine whether this crisis can be contained or whether it marks the beginning of something far larger. But the damage is already done. Trust, once broken, does not return. And North America will never be the same.